Welcome. If you clicked on this video, there's a very specific reason. And I want you to know that reason is not an accident. Somewhere in your life, right now, or maybe not too long ago, you found yourself in a place you never expected to be. A place of silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes from a quiet morning or a calm evening walk. No. This is a different kind of silence entirely. This is the silence that descends when everything is falling apart and you drop to your knees and whisper, or maybe scream a prayer and you wait for an answer. And you wait, and you keep waiting, and nothing comes. That silence is what this video is about. In the next several chapters, we are going to go on a journey together. We are going to explore why God goes quiet at the exact moments when you feel you need Him the most. We are going to talk about the science behind silence, the theology behind silence, the emotional weight of silence, and most importantly, the purpose that silence carries. Because here's what I need you to understand before we even begin, that silence is not the same as absence. Not hearing God is not the same as God not being there. And the season you are in right now, the one that feels the most abandoned, the most confusing, the most painful, that season may be the most important season of your entire spiritual life. By the time this video ends, you will understand why. You will walk away with a completely new framework for thinking about the moments when heaven seems closed. You will hear stories of people who stood exactly where you are standing now and came out the other side with a faith so deep it could not be shaken. And you will find something you may have thought you lost: hope. So settle in. Let us begin. There is a moment that almost everyone who has ever believed in something greater than themselves eventually faces. It is a moment that theologians have written about for centuries, that poets have tried to put into words, that counselors see every week in their offices. It is the moment you realize the line has gone quiet, that the connection you thought you had, the one that used to feel so real, so warm, so present, has gone still. And in that stillness, the first thing most people feel is not peace. It is panic. Think about the last time you tried to call someone in an emergency and the call would not go through. That frantic feeling, tapping the phone screen, checking the signal, trying again, that is what spiritual silence feels like. Except instead of a phone, it is your entire soul reaching out. And instead of a few minutes of frustration, this silence can last days, weeks, sometimes years. I want to start this journey by telling you about a woman named Rachel. Rachel was 34 years old, a devoted believer who had served in her church since she was a teenager. She had grown up with faith as the center of her home. Prayer was as natural to her as breathing. She knew the scriptures. She knew the promises. She had seen God work in her life in ways that were, to her, undeniably real. A healed relationship, a job that came through at the last minute, a night years ago when she felt a presence in her room, so powerful she wept for an hour without knowing exactly why. And then her daughter got sick, not a small sickness, a diagnosis that came down like a hammer on a quiet Tuesday afternoon: pediatric cancer. Stage 3, the doctors were honest with her. It would be a long road and there were no guarantees. Rachel did what any person of faith would do. She prayed, she fasted, she called her church. She had elders lay hands on her daughter and anoint her with oil. She stayed up through the night crying out to the God she had trusted her entire life. She opened her Bible every morning looking for a word, a sign, a single sentence that would tell her everything was going to be okay. The silence she received was deafening. For 6 months, Rachel described her spiritual life as walking through a room with no lights, no windows, and no doors she could find. The prayers she sent up felt like they bounced off the ceiling and fell back on her head. The scriptures she read felt like words on paper, meaningful to someone, somewhere, in some other time, but hollow to her. The worship songs that used to make her cry in the best way now felt like songs in a language she no longer understood. She told me later, "I did not lose faith in God, but I completely lost faith that God was listening to me." That distinction is important, and it is one we will return to again and again throughout this video. Because most people who walk through spiritual silence do not actually stop believing God exists. What they lose is the felt sense of connection, the intimacy, the nearness. And when that goes, the silence that fills its place is one of the loneliest experiences a human being can have. Because here is the thing about spiritual loneliness. It is uniquely painful in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. You can tell a friend you feel lonely, and they will sit with you. You can tell a therapist you feel disconnected, and they can give you tools. But when the thing you feel disconnected from is God, the very foundation of your identity, your hope, your understanding of the universe, there is no human being who can fully fill that space, and so the silence grows. Rachel's story does not end in that dark room, but we will come back to her, because the part of her story that comes next is the part that will change the way you hear your own silence. For now, understand this, you are not alone in this experience. The silence you are feeling has been felt by prophets, by saints, by every believer who ever walked a serious spiritual road. And the very fact that it hurts so much is evidence of something important about who you are. Summary, the silence of God is one of the most universal and painful spiritual experiences. It is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign that you have walked deeply enough into faith to enter its most transformative territory. Rachel's story introduces us to the human reality of divine silence, and the journey to understand it begins here. Let us go a little deeper into why this silence feels so personal. Because one of the most disorienting things about the experience is not just the quiet itself, it is the timing. God does not tend to go quiet when things are going well. When you got that promotion, when the relationship was thriving, when the kids were healthy and the bills were paid, those were not usually the seasons of spiritual drought. No. The silence tends to descend precisely when you are at your most vulnerable. When the ground is already shaking under your feet, and that feels like betrayal. I want to be honest with you about something. I have heard pastors try to explain divine silence by immediately pivoting to theology, to talk about how God is sovereign, how his ways are not our ways, how we just need to trust. And while all of that is true, I think sometimes those explanations are offered a little too quickly. They are offered in a way that skips over the very real, very human anguish of the moment. And when someone who is drowning gets a theological lecture instead of a hand, the theology does not help much. So before we get to answers, let us really sit in the question, why does it feel so personal? Because your relationship with God, if you have cultivated one, is deeply personal. It is not academic. It is not just doctrinal. For people who have known real intimacy in prayer, real moments of divine encounter, real seasons where the presence of God was palpable and close, when that goes away, it does not feel like a theological puzzle. It feels like a person you love has stopped answering your calls. There is a psychological concept called anxious attachment, developed by researcher John Bowlby and later expanded by others. It describes what happens when a person who has formed a deep emotional bond with another person suddenly loses access to that bond. The result is not simply sadness. It is anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, and a frantic searching behavior, calling more, reaching more, checking more, trying desperately to restore the connection.
And when the connection is not restored quickly, a deeper despair sets in. one that goes beyond missing the person.
One that begins to question whether the connection was ever real. This is what many people experience in spiritual silence. They begin to wonder, was any of it real? Did I imagine the encounters? Was I just feeling my own emotions and calling them God? Was the warmth I felt in worship just group psychology? Was the answered prayer just coincidence? These questions are not signs of weak faith. They are signs of a faith that has been pressed hard enough to crack, and cracks, as we will explore later in this video, are not always the end of something. Sometimes they are the beginning. There is a poet named David, and you may know him as King David from the Bible, who wrote something in one of his most famous Psalms that deserves more attention than it usually gets. He wrote, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? Those are not the words of a man who had a casual relationship with faith. Those are not the words of someone going through a mild spiritual dry spell. That is raw bleeding, desperate anguish. That is a man who had built his entire life on the reality of God's presence, crying out because that presence had vanished. And notice something important. David did not pretend. He did not write a worship song that glossed over the pain. He did not write a worship song that glossed over the pain. He did not post something inspiring to encourage others while privately dying inside. He wrote the truth of what he felt. He put his anguish directly before God in the most public format a person of his time could use. And he kept writing, kept speaking, kept directing his raw emotion toward the very one he felt had abandoned him. That is a template. We will come back to it. For now, sit with this. The silence is not unique to you. The pain of it is not a sign of your failure. And the fact that you are still reaching, still asking, still searching, still watching this video looking for answers means something essential about your soul has not given up. Hold on to that, because the next thing we need to understand is what the silence is not. And removing those false explanations is just as important as finding the true ones. Summary, divine silence feels personal because our relationship with God is personal. It triggers a deep psychological and spiritual disorientation. But people like David, one of the most celebrated believers in history, experienced the same anguish. The pain of silence is not evidence of God's rejection. It is evidence of how real the relationship is. One of the most damaging things that happens when God goes quiet is the story we tell ourselves to explain it. And I want to spend some time here, because these stories, the ones we construct in the absence of a clear answer, can do tremendous long-term deed. A mage to our faith, our identity, and our ability to eventually receive what God is actually doing. So let us talk about the three most common false explanations people reach for when God goes silent. The first is, I have done something wrong and God is punishing me. This one is almost reflexive. For people with a deep sense of moral accountability, and most serious believers have one, the silence of God triggers an immediate audit. What did I do? What sin did I fail to confess? What area of my life did I hold back from Him? There is a scrambling, a reviewing of every recent thought and action, a desperate hunt for the offense that caused the connection to go dark. Now, I am not saying that there is never a connection between our choices and our spiritual experience. Scripture does speak about sin creating separation, but the automatic assumption that silence equals punishment is a deeply flawed and often harmful framework. It turns God into a punitive parent who withdraws love when displeased. And it turns the silent person into someone constantly scanning for what they did wrong, rather than asking what they are being invited into. Rachel, the woman I mentioned earlier, fell into this trap hard. During the 6 months of her daughter's illness, she spent enormous emotional energy trying to identify what she had done to deserve this silence. She confessed every sin she could remember. She repented of things she was not even sure were sins. She made promises. She bargained. And the silence continued, because the silence in her case was not punishment. It was preparation. But she could not know that yet. The second false explanation is, my faith is not strong enough. This one is particularly cruel in the way it works, because it takes the experience of spiritual pain, which is already destabilizing, and adds a layer of self-condemnation. It says, if you were a better believer, a stronger Christian, a more faithful Muslim, a more devoted Jew, if your spirituality were deeper and more mature, you would not be experiencing this silence. The implication is that the silence is a grade, and you failed, and you failed. This explanation has its roots in certain theological traditions that overemphasize the role of human faith in determining divine action, and it creates a vicious cycle. The more silent God seems, the more you doubt your faith. The more you doubt your faith, the more performance anxiety you bring to your spiritual practice. The more anxious and performative your prayers become, the less like genuine connection they feel. And so the silence deepens, not because God moved, but because you began relating to prayer as an audition rather than a conversation. The third false explanation is the most dangerous. God does not exist, or at least he does not care about me. This is where prolonged silence without proper understanding can lead people, not necessarily to atheism, but to a kind of cosmic orphanhood. A sense that even if God is real, he is distant, disinterested, or simply too occupied with larger things to attend to one specific person's need. And I want to address this one with particular care, because I think it is possible to honor the intellectual honesty of that doubt, while also recognizing that it is drawing a conclusion from insufficient data. The absence of felt experience is not the same as the absence of reality. We know this in the physical world. Before we had instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational waves, those waves still existed, bending space-time, carrying information across billions of light years. They were not less real because we could not detect them. The limitation was in the instrument, not in the phenomenon. What we will explore as we go deeper is that divine silence often has purposes that we simply cannot perceive from within the silence itself. The meaning of the quiet becomes visible only in retrospect. And while that is cold comfort in the middle of the night when you are weeping and waiting, it is not no comfort. It is something. It is a reason to keep going just a little longer. And sometimes keeping going just a little longer is all it takes. Summary: the three most common false explanations for divine silence: punishment, lack of faith, and divine indifference. Each cause harm in distinct ways. They redirect energy towards self-condemnation rather than toward understanding. Removing false explanations is the first step toward finding the real ones. Before we go further into why God is quiet, I want to tell you about a man who lived in the 19th century. His name was Charles Spurgeon. And if you know anything about the history of Christian preaching, you know that name. Spurgeon was considered the greatest preacher of the Victorian age. He pastored a church in London that held over 5,000 people at a time when there were no microphones, no sound systems, no social media to fill the seats. People came from across England just to hear him preach. He was brilliant, passionate, full of faith, and utterly devoted to God. He also suffered from crippling depression for most of his adult life. Spurgeon was remarkably open about his dark seasons, which was extraordinary for his time when mental and spiritual struggle were seen as signs of weakness or lack of faith. He wrote candidly about periods when he felt nothing, when the God he preached about with such power and eloquence seemed to withdraw completely. He described lying in bed, unable to pray, unable to feel, unable to do anything but endure. He called these seasons his sloughs of despond, borrowing the image from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a bug that threatened to swallow. Below you whole, and yet Spurgeon did not stop. He did not abandon his faith. He did not conclude from his silences that God was not real or that his life's work was a fraud. He continued. He preached through the silences. He wrote through the silences. He wrote through the silences. He counseled thousands of other people through their silences, even while he was walking through one of his own. And when the silences lifted, when the warmth returned and the connection was restored, he emerged with a depth of understanding and compassion for human suffering that made his ministry immeasurably more effective. The people who sat in his church on Sunday mornings were not sitting with a man who had only ever known spiritual sunshine. They were sitting with a man who had walked through spiritual midnight and survived. There is something specific and important happening in that story that goes beyond the inspirational. Spurgeon's silence did not make him less of who he was. It made him more. It stripped away the parts of his faith that were dependent on feeling good and revealed the parts that were durable, real, and unshakable. When you cannot feel God's presence and you still choose to remain faithful, that is a different quality of faith than the faith that exists only when the presence is palpable. Think of it this way. Anyone can love someone when that person is warm, present, and responsive. The test of love, the quality that distinguishes deep love from casual preference, is what you do when the person is cold, distant, or absent. A marriage is not tested in the good years. It is tested in the hard ones. And the marriages that survive the hard ones, and the marriages that survive the hard ones, the ones where two people chose each other even when the feeling was not there, those are the marriages that produce a depth of intimacy that was never possible in the easy seasons. The silence of God works the same way. When everything is going well and God feels close and prayers seem answered quickly, and life has a sense of divine direction, faith is relatively easy, not meaningless, not false, but relatively uncomplicated. But when the silence comes and you choose every single day to keep trusting, to keep showing up, to keep directing your life toward the God you cannot currently feel, you are building something that cannot be built any other way. You are building what the ancient texts call faithfulness. Not faith as a feeling, faith as a practice, faith as a decision repeated so many times, it becomes the architecture of your soul. Spurgeon knew this. It did not make his depressions hurt less, but it gave them meaning. And meaning, as the great psychologist Viktor Frankl discovered in one of the darkest places in human history, is what makes suffering survivable. We will return to the question of meaning throughout this video, because I believe that one of the deepest purposes of divine silence is not merely to test faith. It is to build something in you that can only be built in the dark. And what gets built in the dark is often the most important structure of your entire life. Summary: Charles Spurgeon, one of history's greatest preachers, walked through profound seasons of spiritual silence and depression. Rather than destroying his faith, these seasons deepened it and expanded his compassion. Silence does not diminish authentic faith. It forges it. Here is something that almost no one talks about when the conversation turns to divine silence. It is something I think gets overlooked because it is uncomfortable. But I think it is one of the most important things to understand. So I want to be direct about it. Sometimes the silence is loud. What I mean is this: when God stops speaking in the ways you are used to hearing Him. It is not always simply empty quiet. Sometimes the silence itself is a form of communication. And part of the spiritual challenge of these seasons is learning to read a different kind of language, one that does not come in the forms you expect. Let me explain what I mean with an analogy. When a parent is teaching a child to walk, there is a period where the parent stops holding the child's hands. The child, who is upright and confident only because of those hands, suddenly feels the grip release. From the child's perspective, this is terrifying. The support is gone. The parent has stepped back. But here is the thing, the parent has not walked out of the room. The parent is still right there, close enough to catch the child if they fall, watching with focused attention, doing the most important thing they could possibly do in that moment, creating the conditions for the child to discover their own balance. The release of the hand is not abandonment. It is graduation. Now, I know the analogy is imperfect. We are not infants. The stakes of adult suffering are far higher than learning to walk. And I am not suggesting that every form of divine silence is as simple as a loving parent stepping back to watch. Some silences are more mysterious than that. Some silences carry weight that deserves more than a tidy analogy. But the core principle matters. The absence of what you were relying on does not mean the absence of care. It may mean the care has taken a different form, one that serves your actual growth rather than your momentary comfort. There is a spiritual teacher, not affiliated with any particular tradition, who once described this dynamic with striking clarity. He said that human beings typically have two kinds of spiritual experiences. The first is what he called the experience of presence, those moments where the divine feels close, warm, and accessible, where prayer feels like conversation, where life seems to have a kind of grab. Sifting through it, these experiences are gifts. They are real, and they matter, and they sustain faith. But the second kind of experience, the one he said actually transforms a person, is the experience of the void. The dark night, the desert, the silence. He said this experience is not the opposite of divine presence. It is a deeper form of it. It is the experience of God without the clothing of feeling, without the ornament of emotion, without the scaffolding of sensory confirmation. Just bare, stripped, naked encounter with the divine reality, which he said is so far beyond our ordinary emotional categories that when it is present in its fullness, it cannot be processed through the usual channels. In other words, the silence may not be the absence of God. The silence may be God, experienced in a form your ordinary spiritual antennae were not designed to receive. That is a challenging idea. I am not asking you to simply accept it. I am asking you to hold it open, to let it sit alongside your pain without requiring it to resolve the pain right now. Because the purpose of this video is not to give you a fast fix. The purpose is to give you a new set of eyes. Eyes that can see in the dark. And in the next section, we begin to look at what the great spiritual traditions of the world have said about this dark seeing. What does the Bible specifically say about the silence of God? And what do those ancient words mean for what you are walking through right now? Summary: divine silence is sometimes a form of communication in itself. Not empty noise, but a deeper frequency of encounter. Like a parent releasing a child's hands to allow them to find their own balance, God's silence may represent an invitation to a deeper, less emotionally scaffolded form of faith. The silence may not be absence. It may be presence in a form we have not yet learned to recognize. Let us open the oldest books we have. If you go into the Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, you will find that the theme of divine silence is not a rare or peripheral concern. It is woven through the entire narrative. From Genesis to Malachi, the story of God's relationship with humanity is punctuated regularly and significantly by seasons where God does not speak, does not appear, does not act in the ways his people expect. The most famous of these is the 400-year silence between the last of the Old Testament prophets and the arrival of John the Baptist. 400 years, 4 centuries during which no prophet arose, no new word was given, no burning bush appeared, no still small voice broke through. For a people whose entire national and spiritual identity was built around the belief that their God spoke to them, that he was present, active and communicative in a way that distinguished him from every idol of the ancient world. 400 years of silence was not a small thing. It was devastating. Generations were born and died during that silence. Children grew up hearing the old stories. How God had spoken to Moses, how he had answered Elijah, how he had called young Samuel by name in the night. And those children never heard that voice themselves. They read about it. They prayed toward it. But the heavens were closed, and then in the fullness of time, that phrase itself is significant. It implies timing, purpose, precision. The silence broke. A baby was born. A voice cried out in the wilderness. The entire architecture of human history shifted. What was God doing during those 400 years? From a strictly human perspective, nothing. From a divine perspective, everything. Nations were rising and falling in ways that prepared the political landscape for a message that would need to travel across the Roman road network. To reach the entire known world. A language was spreading, Greek, that would become the perfect vehicle for the transmission of that message. Cultures were colliding and blending in ways that created a unique moment of spiritual readiness. The silence was not waiting. The silence was building. We will return to this again. But I want you to carry it with you as we look at specific moments in Scripture where individuals, not just nations, experience the divine silence. Consider Job. If you know anything about this story, you know it is one of the most raw, honest, and psychologically sophisticated texts in all of ancient literature. Job was a righteous man. By the account of the text itself, he was the most righteous man of his time. He had done everything right. He had lived well, loved God, served others, walked with integrity. And then in a series of devastating blows, he lost everything. His wealth, his children, his health. He sat on an ash heap, scraping his wounds with broken pottery, surrounded by friends who told him, with the best theological reasoning of their day, that he must have sinned, that God must be punishing him, that the solution was confession and repentance. Job refused this explanation, not because he was arrogant, but because it was not true. He knew his own conscience. He had not done what his friends accused him of. And then he did something extraordinary. He demanded an audience with God. He did not quietly accept the silence. He did not retreat into polite, resigned prayer. He argued. He challenged. He said, essentially, I want answers, and I want them from God himself, not from your theology. And after 37 chapters of Job speaking, and his friends speaking, and a young man named Elihu speaking, after all of that human noise, God finally speaks. And what God says is not an apology. It is not an explanation of the reasons for Job's suffering. It is something more confronting and more magnificent than either of those things. God asks Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when the morning stars sang together? God responds to Job's demand for explanation with an overwhelming disclosure of divine scale. Look at the size of what I am, he says. Look at the breadth of what I am holding together. Not to crush Job, but to reorient him, to restore his perspective, to give him back the sense of scale that his suffering had taken from him. And Job's response is not defeat. It is not shame. It is something that sounds to the careful reader like peace. He says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." The silence had not answered his questions, but the silence had prepared him for an encounter with divine reality that no explanation could have given him. He did not understand his suffering any better than he did before. But he saw God in a way he had never seen him before. And somehow, in a way that does not resolve logically, but resonates deeply. That was enough. Summary scripture is filled with seasons of divine silence. Most dramatically, the 400 years between the Old and New Testaments. Job's story models the faithful demand for encounter, even in silence, not passive resignation, but active, honest wrestling. And when God finally speaks to Job, it is not with answers, but with revelation, and it is enough. Now let us look at another figure whose experience with divine silence is less commonly discussed, but equally profound: the prophet Elijah. Here is a man who had one of the most spectacular public spiritual experiences in the entire Bible. He prayed, and fire fell from heaven and consumed a sacrifice drenched in water on Mount Carmel. He prayed, and rain ended a 3-year drought. He stood before kings and spoke truth when no one else dared. If you were putting together a highlight reel of bold, dramatic spiritual encounters, Elijah's footage would be near the top. And then, immediately after his greatest victory, immediately after the fire fell, after the rain came, after the prophets of Baal were defeated, Elijah ran into the desert and asked God to let him die. The sequence is startling. Victory, then collapse. Fire, then exhaustion. A queen threatened his life, and this man, who had just faced down hundreds of false prophets, was suddenly broken. He sat under a solitary tree and said, "It is enough, Lord. Take my life." And here is what is remarkable about God's response. In that moment, God did not speak. Instead, an angel touched Elijah and said, "Get up and eat." There was bread and a jar of water beside him. "Eat," the angel said. "The journey is too much for you." God's first response to Elijah's despair was not a theology lecture. It was not an explanation of purpose, a reminder of calling, a rebuking of self-pity. It was food and water and rest. Because before any spiritual truth could reach Elijah, his body needed care. Before any divine word could land in him, his physical and emotional exhaustion needed to be acknowledged and addressed. This is a stunning piece of pastoral wisdom embedded in ancient text, and it speaks to something important about how God relates to human beings in seasons of darkness and silence. He meets us in our bodies first. He meets us in our basic needs. He meets us in the practical, unglamorous, unspiritual sounding realities of sleep and food and rest. And only then, once Elijah has eaten twice and slept and traveled 40 days to Mount Horeb, only then does God ask, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And on that mountain, something happens that is the most important thing we will hear today regarding the nature of divine communication. A great wind comes, powerful enough to split mountains and shatter rocks, but God was not in the wind. Then an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. Then a fire, but God was not in the fire. And then, after the fire, a still small voice. Some translations say a sound of sheer silence, a gentle whisper. God was in the whisper. This moment is one of the most theologically dense in all of Scripture, and it speaks directly to the experience we are exploring in this video. Elijah had been trained to recognize God in the spectacular. The fire from heaven, the dramatic drought-ending prayer, the public confrontations, these were the frequencies on which he had learned to hear the divine. And on Mount Horeb, God was demonstrating something that would take Elijah and us a lifetime to fully understand. I am not always in the spectacle. I am in the whisper. I am in the still small voice. I am in the quiet that comes after everything else has passed. The silence is not the absence of God's voice. It may be the exact form his voice is taking in this season. And the reason you cannot hear it is not because he has stopped speaking. It may be because you have been listening for thunder when he is whispering. Summary: Elijah's story reveals that God meets us in our physical reality before our spiritual reality. More importantly, the lesson of Mount Horeb is foundational. God is not always in the dramatic, the spectacular, or the loud. He is in the still small voice, the whisper that comes after everything else goes quiet. The silence may be the voice itself, speaking in a frequency we have not yet learned to receive. There is a phrase that has been used across centuries by mystics, saints, monks, and ordinary believers who have stumbled into deep spiritual darkness without a map. That phrase is the dark night of the soul. It comes originally from a 16th century Spanish mystic named Ed John of the Cross, who wrote a poem and a commentary about his own experience of profound spiritual desolation. He wrote it while imprisoned by members of his own religious order, locked in a tiny cell with no books, insufficient food, and almost no light. And in that darkness, literal and figurative, he wrote some of the most beautiful and insightful poetry about the spiritual life ever composed. What John of the Cross described was not merely depression, though depression may accompany it. It was not simply a dry spell in prayer, though dryness is one of its features. What he described was a systematic stripping away of every spiritual consolation, every felt sense of God, every emotional reward of the spiritual life, leaving the person in a place of pure, stark, seemingly abandoned emptiness. And his radical claim, the claim that has made his work endure for 5 centuries, was that this stripping is not an accident, not a punishment, and not a malfunction. It is a gift, the most demanding and most transformative gift the soul can receive. Because what gets stripped away in the dark night is not the soul's true love of God. What gets stripped away is everything the soul had been mistaking for God. The feelings, the consolations, the experiences, the sense of certainty and warmth, the emotional rewards, all of it removed, until what is left is the naked choice. Do I love this God I cannot feel, or did I love only the feeling? That is the question the dark night asks, and it is the most important question a spiritual life can face. Because if the answer is, I loved only the feeling, then the dark night becomes the beginning of an authentic relationship with the divine. The kind that does not depend on performance or emotional state. The kind that is simply stubbornly chosen. And if the answer is, even without feeling, even without consolation, even without any evidence I can point to, I still choose this, then something profound has happened. The foundation of your spiritual life has shifted from sand to stone, from feeling to commitment, from religion as entertainment to faith as identity. John of the Cross did not ask for his dark night. It came to him uninvited, unwanted, in conditions of extraordinary physical and emotional duress. But he emerged from it. After a period of time he described as feeling endless, with a clarity of spiritual vision and a depth of union with the divine. that he could not have accessed any other way. The darkness had been the passageway. The silence had been the teacher. We will spend significant time later in this video talking about what exactly gets built in us during the silent seasons, what capacities are developed, what understanding deepens, what aspects of character are forged in these dark furnaces. Because understanding what is being built is one of the most powerful ways of enduring the building process. But first, I want to take you into the psychological and neuroscientific dimension of this experience. Because I think understanding what happens in the human brain and body during spiritual silence helps us both honor the reality of the suffering and contextualize it in a larger frame. Summary: John of the Cross named the experience that millions have lived through without language for it the dark night of the soul. His radical insight was that this stripping of spiritual consolation is not punishment but purification, removing everything the soul mistook for God until what remains is pure. Chosen love. This is one of the most transformative processes in the entire spiritual life. There is a growing body of neuroscience research on spiritual experience. And while the relationship between brain science and theology is genuinely complex, and I do not intend to reduce one to the other, there are insights from this field that can be profoundly helpful in understanding what happens during spiritual drought. When people report experiences of divine presence, moments of felt encounter with God, deep prayer states, transcendent experiences, the brain shows distinctive patterns of activity. Researchers using neuroimaging have documented changes in several brain regions during these states, including the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, and particularly areas involved in self-referential processing. What is especially interesting is that deeply contemplative states, particularly those involving selfless absorption in prayer or meditation, sometimes show a quieting of the default mode network, which is the brain's system for self-referential thinking. The interior chatter, the constant self-monitoring, the endless stream of self-focused thoughts, it quiets down. And in that quieting, people often report profound experiences of connection, peace, and presence. Now, here's the interesting question. What happens when the brain's ability to enter those states is disrupted? Because stress, grief, trauma, and prolonged anxiety, all of which commonly accompany the life circumstances that trigger a spiritual crisis, have well-documented effects on the brain's capacity for what might be called contemplative access. When the stress response is chronically activated, when the nervous system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, when sleep is disrupted and the body is in a sustained state of alert, the brain becomes much less capable of the kind of settled receptive openness that spiritual experience requires. In other words, your capacity to feel God may be significantly impaired, not because God has moved, but because your brain, under the crushing weight of what you are carrying, has lost access to the neural pathways through which we usually register spiritual experience. Think about what this means for someone in crisis. The very circumstances most likely to send them to their knees in desperate prayer, illness, loss, fear, grief, are the same circumstances most likely to render them neurologically less capable of receiving the experience of answer and comfort they are praying for. This is not a theological problem. It is a biological one. And it is kingly ironic. A dear friend of mine, who is both a clinical psychologist and a theologian, put it this way: God does not stop broadcasting because you are in crisis. But crisis may be precisely what throws your receiver out of range. The signal is there. The problem is temporary disruption in your capacity to receive it. Does this mean spiritual silence is nothing more than a neurological event? I want to be careful here. No, I do not think that. I think human beings are far more complex than any purely materialist account can capture, And I think the transcendent is real in ways that go beyond brain states. But I think the neuroscience offers us something important. It gives us permission to be compassionate with ourselves, to understand that our inability to feel God in the middle of our worst seasons may have as much to do with the physiological weight of what we are carrying as with any spiritual failing on our part. When you are in the middle of the worst night of your life and prayer feels like nothing and silence is all you hear, your brain is also in the worst night of its life. It is worth being kind to both. And there is something else the neuroscience tells us that is genuinely hopeful. Trauma, grief, and prolonged stress do not permanently alter the brain's capacity for spiritual experience. The brain is plastic. It heals. Given time, care, rest, and eventually the lessening of the acute stress, the neural pathways reopen. The cont and plate of access returns. And when it does, when the receiver comes back online and the signal that was always there finally breaks through, the experience is often extraordinarily vivid and powerful, precisely because the contrast with the preceding silence is so stark. The silence ends, and when it does not end quietly. Summary: neuroscience reveals that the very crises which drive us to prayer also impair the brain's capacity to receive spiritual experience. This biological reality helps explain felt silence without reducing it to pure neurology. The brain heals, contemplative access returns, and the ending of silence is often marked by extraordinary breakthrough, which is why it is so important to not give up during the drought. Now I want to talk about something that most discussions of divine silence avoid almost entirely, and that is the relationship between silence and intimacy. We think of silence as the absence of connection, but anyone who has ever loved someone deeply, truly deeply, knows that silence is not always absence. There is a kind of silence that is presence, the silence between two people who are completely comfortable with each other, who do not need to fill every moment with words, who can sit together and not speak and feel more connected than many people feel in their loudest conversations. There is a quality of relationship in which the need for constant verbal reassurance has been outgrown, where trust is deep enough that absence is not interpreted as rejection, where love is secure enough that silence is not threatening. And most marriages, most deep friendships, most meaningful long-term relationships pass through a stage where this kind of silent intimacy becomes possible. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be manufactured. It can only be grown. And it is grown through exactly the kind of experience we are exploring in this vid. EO, the experience of staying in relationship through seasons when the communication feels one-sided or absent. The experience of choosing to trust when you cannot feel the trustworthiness. The experience of continuing to show up when showing up yields no immediate emotional return. Might the divine silence be, at least in part, an invitation into this deeper form of intimacy? Not the intimacy of emotion and experience, though that has its place and its beauty, but the intimacy of pure, chosen, unconditional trust. The kind that says, I do not need you to constantly reassure me. I know who you are. I have chosen you, and that does not change based on whether I can feel you right now. There is a scene in one of the most beloved novels of the 20th century. C.S. Lewis's exploration of his own grief after the death of his wife, published under the title, A Grief Observed, where Lewis describes reaching a point in his grief where the sense of God's absence was so total that he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. He compared it to a door slamming shut in his face. He knocked and was not answered. He tried every door he could find and found them all closed. And then, after he had spent the worst of his desperation and exhaustion, something shifted. Not that the grief went away, not that the questions were answered, but a kind of clearing happened. And in that clearing, Lewis wrote something that has stayed with readers for decades. He said that perhaps God had not been absent at all. Perhaps what he had interpreted as a slamming door had actually been God holding the door, holding it firmly, not to keep Lewis out, but to keep him from running away, from running into some easier consolation that would have taken his grief but not resolved it. The resistance he had felt as the door, he began to wonder whether it was the resistance of being held. That reframe is one of the most significant spiritual insights I have ever encountered, because it suggests that what we experience as the locked door of the divine, the silence, the absence, the seeming rebuff, may sometimes be the exact opposite of what it feels like. Maybe the feeling of being held firmly in place by a love that will not let you escape into something smaller than what you are becoming. Summary: silence is not always the opposite of intimacy. In deep relationships, silence can be the highest form of presence, the resting point of unconditional trust. C.S. Lewis's profound reframe of divine silence as being held rather than shut out offers one of the most transformative ways to understand what God may be doing in the quiet. The resistance you feel may be the feeling of love that will not let you go. Let us talk about grief, because grief and spiritual silence are deeply intertwined. And understanding grief as a spiritual experience, not just a psychological one, is essential if we are going to understand why God goes quiet when we lose someone or something we love. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us the famous 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. This framework has been enormously useful in clinical settings and has helped millions of people normalize their emotional experience after loss. But Kubler-Ross herself was always careful to point out that grief does not move through these stages in a linear, orderly fashion. It circles and doubles back. It jumps and stalls. It sometimes sits in one place for years. What Kubler-Ross did not address, because it was outside her clinical framework, is the spiritual dimension of grief. The way loss does not just change how you feel, but how you relate to the universe itself. How the death of someone you love does not just break your heart, but cracks open your cosmology, your understanding of how the world works, your felt sense of whether it is safe, whether it is ordered, whether it is cared for. And right in the center of that cracked open cosmology is the question of God's silence. Why did he not stop this? Why did he not answer my prayers? Why did I feel him so clearly before? And now, in the deepest grief of my life, I feel nothing. What kind of God is silent when his children are breaking? These questions do not have simple answers. I want to be honest about that. But I think they have real answers. Answers that require depth and patience and a willingness to sit in discomfort rather than reach for the nearest comfortable theological platitude. One of the most important things I have learned from listening to people walk through grief and through pastoral counseling and personal reflection is that the silence of God in grief often serves a function that is related to but distinct from all the other functions we have discussed. In grief, the silence is sometimes about allowing the loss to be real. Let me explain. When we pray desperately for God to fix something, to heal, to restore, to prevent, we are, in a sense, asking God to undo the loss before we have fully experienced it. And there are times, profound, miraculous times, when God does exactly that. But there are also times when the loss must be real, when the person must be grieved, when the marriage must be mourned, when the dream must be released, when the season of life that is over must be buried properly. And in those times, the silence may be God's way of creating the space in which the loss can be real. If he swooped in immediately with comfort, with answers, with quick repair, the grief would not be fully entered. The loss would not be truly processed. And you would carry the unfinished grief forward with you into whatever comes next, like a wound that, covered before it was cleaned. The silence holds open the space for authentic mourning. And authentic mourning, as counterintuitive as this sounds, is one of the most sacred things a human being can do. Summary grief and divine silence are inseparable experiences. The silence in seasons of loss is not indifference. It is space. Space for the loss to be real, for mourning to be authentic, for the cracked cosmology to do its necessary breaking before it can be rebuilt. God's silence in grief may be the most tender form of respect for the depth of what you have lost. I want to take you now into some territory that might be uncomfortable for some of you, but I think it is critical. I want to talk about the ways we sometimes create our own silence. Not all spiritual silence is externally imposed. Not all of it is God's sovereign action or mysterious purpose. Sometimes, and this is important, sometimes the silence is the result of something we have built between ourselves and the divine. Not a wall erected by God, a wall we have slowly, often unconsciously, assembled brick by brick. This is different from the punishment narrative we discussed earlier. I am not saying God is angry with you. I am saying that the human heart has a remarkable capacity for self-protection, and that self-protection, especially after spiritual disappointment, can take the form of a graduated withdrawal from authentic prayer and genuine seeking. It works like this. You ask God for something real, something important, and the answer that comes is not the one you asked for. Maybe it is a no. Maybe it is a silence. Maybe it is a terrible yes to the thing you were most afraid of, and it hurts deeply. And without necessarily making a conscious decision, you begin to protect yourself. Your prayers become a little more formal, a little more careful. You stop asking for the things that really matter, because asking for what really matters and not receiving it hurts more than not asking at all. You retreat to the safe distance of general praise and theological acknowledgement while keeping your real self, your real needs, your real fears, your real desires, carefully guarded behind a wall of religious vocabulary. And in that carefully guarded place, the silence grows, not because God went anywhere, but because the communication stopped being real. There is a name for this in relational psychology. It is called protective withdrawal, and it is one of the most common patterns in any relationship that has been through significant hurt. You do not leave. You do not stop showing up, but you stop being fully present, because full presence means full exposure, and full exposure means you can be hurt again. The question worth sitting with, and I ask it gently, without any accusation, is whether any part of your current silence is this kind of silence. Whether some portion of the quiet you are experiencing is the echo of your own withdrawal. Whether the God you are praying to has become, over time, a slightly safer, slightly more manageable, slightly more arm's-length version of the wild and intimate divine that once both terrified and attracted you. I have walked through this myself. I know its particular texture. The prayers that feel performative, the worship that feels like going through motions, the Bible reading that fills the checkbox, but does not touch anything real, and the strange loneliness of being in the presence of God without actually being present. If this resonates with you, the good news is that the wall is yours, which means it can come down. It can come down through honesty, through choosing, even once, to bring the real thing to God. The anger, the disappointment, the doubt, the disappointment, the doubt, the question you have been afraid to ask because read that asking it would mean you did not have enough faith. Bring it, all of it. in my experience and in the experience of every authentic spiritual person I have ever known. The real prayer, however messy, however angry, however full of doubt, the real prayer connects far more reliably than the polished, careful, safe one. Summary: not all divine silence is divinely imposed. Sometimes we create our own silence through protective withdrawal, retreating from authentic prayer after spiritual disappointment. Recognizing this pattern is not an occasion for shame, but for honest return. The way back is through bringing the real self, fears, doubts, anger, and all, back to the divine encounter. Now I want to tell you about a man most of you probably know very little about. His name was Thomas à Kempis, and he was a 15th century monk who wrote a small book called The Imitation of Christ. It became one of the most widely read books in history, second only, some say, to the Bible itself. It has been translated into hundreds of languages and has been read by people as diverse as Thomas More, Ignatius of Loyola, John Wesley, and Dag Hammarskjöld. And at the heart of Thomas à Kempis's writing is a theme that is strikingly relevant to our discussion: the value of interior silence. Not just the absence of noise, but the cultivation of a deep interior stillness, a quieting of the ego, the ambitions, the constant churning of desire and fear that creates the conditions within which the divine can be heard and known. Thomas wrote, "Many words satisfy not the soul, but a good life refresheth the mind." He wrote about the futility of seeking knowledge, reputation, and spiritual entertainment as substitutes for genuine interior transformation. He was deeply skeptical of the religious culture of his day. The debates, the lectures, the elaborate liturgical performances, which he saw as often serving the ego rather than the soul. And he kept returning to the same theme: be still, go within, cultivate the silence inside yourself, and in that silence, the divine will be found. This is a profound inversion of the normal approach to spiritual silence. Rather than experiencing interior silence as something that happens to us against our will, as a deprivation, a loss, a cause of suffering, Thomas à Kempis invites us to enter it intentionally, to seek it, to cultivate it as a discipline and a practice, to come to the silence rather than simply suffering through it. The contemplative traditions within Christianity, within Buddhism, within Sufism, within many indigenous spiritual practices around the world, all of them have developed specific disciplines aimed at producing exactly this kind of interior stillness, centering prayer, lectio divina, silent meditation, the prayer of examination. The desert fathers and mothers who withdrew from the noise of Roman civilization in the 3rd and 4th centuries to sit in the Egyptian desert with nothing but God and their own interior landscape. What were they all looking for? Not spiritual experiences in the dramatic sense, not visions and voices and fire from heaven. They were looking for what the Quakers later called the inner light, the still, steady, permanent, underlying presence of the divine that does not come and go with emotional weather, that is not louder in good times and quieter in hard ones, that is simply there beneath every experience, requiring only enough interior quiet to be perceived. The silence you are suffering through involuntarily, they cultivated intentionally, not because suffering is good, but because they understood that what lies underneath the noise of ordinary life is something infinitely worth finding. And perhaps, just perhaps, the involuntary silence of your current season is preparing you for an intentional relationship with interior stillness that you would never have chosen to seek on your own. Perhaps the loss of the loud felt emotionally rich form of spiritual experience is creating the hunger and the capacity for something deeper and more permanent. Summary Thomas à Kempis and the contemplative traditions point to a profound inversion. The silence we suffer through involuntarily, they cultivated intentionally. Interior stillness is the medium through which the deep, permanent, unshakable presence of the divine is accessed. The involuntary silence of a dark season may be preparing us for the intentional silence of a deeper spiritual practice. Here is something I want to say clearly and directly, because I think it needs to be said. Divine silence is not always comfortable, and it is not supposed to be. There is a tendency in contemporary spirituality, especially in the more popular, accessible forms of it, to suggest that discomfort is always a sign of spiritual misalignment. That if you are practicing right, believing right, thinking right, you will have peace, you will have joy, you will have a sense of divine nearness. And when you are troubled, when you are despairing, when you feel nothing, the implication is that you are doing something wrong. And the solution is to adjust your spiritual practice until the discomfort goes away. This is not only unhelpful, in some cases, it is actively harmful. Because some of the most important work that happens in the human soul happens precisely in discomfort. Growth hurts. Transformation hurts. Being stretched beyond who you currently are, in any dimension of life, involves a period of instability and pain before the new capacity settles. Every athlete knows this in their body. Every therapist knows this in the mind. And every genuine spiritual tradition knows this in the soul. The doctrine of easy, comfortable spirituality is seductive because it is what we want. We want the presence without the process. We want the goal without the furnace. We want the deep water without having to swim out beyond the shallows where we could still stand. But the deep water is where the great fish are. The furnace is what purifies the gold, and the process, the uncomfortable, disorienting, sometimes agonizing process of spiritual transformation, is what produces people whose faith is something genuinely extraordinary. Something that can hold weight. Something that can speak to others who are in their own dark nights, not from a book, but from experience. Think about the plea in your own life, whose faith you most deeply respect. I suspect they are not the people whose lives have been easy, whose prayers have always been answered quickly, whose relationship with God has been an uninterrupted experience of warmth and blessing. I suspect they are the people who have been through something, who have walked in the fire and come out the other side, who carry a quietness in them that is not emptiness but depth, whose words about God carry weight because they come from a place you can tell has known real cost. That quality, that gravity, that depth, that unshakable rootedness is not produced by comfortable seasons. It is produced by exactly the kind of season you may be in right now. I want to be careful not to romanticize suffering. Not everyone who walks through spiritual darkness comes out the other side with that depth. Some people come out embittered. Some come out disillusioned. Some come out still carrying the wound. The darkness is not automatically transformative. What matters is what you do with it. Whether you bring it honestly to God or seal it away. Whether you allow it to ask its deepest questions or suppress them. Whether you keep walking even when you cannot see, or whether you sit down and refuse to move. And those choices, made every day, small and uncelebrated, in the dark, those are the choices that determine whether the silence becomes a grave or a womb. Summary, spiritual discomfort is not a sign of misalignment. It is often a sign of genuine transformation and progress. The faith we most respect is forged in fire, not formed in ease. The dark season can be a grave or a womb, depending on the choices made within it. And those daily choices made in the dark are among the most significant choices a person can make. Let us come back now to Rachel. I told you at the beginning about her daughter's illness, and I want to tell you what happened as the months wore on. Because there is something in her story that I think is the most important thing we will encounter today. 6 months into her daughter's treatment, Rachel was in a place of profound spiritual emptiness. The prayers had not stopped. She still showed up every morning, still opened her Bible, still went to her church. But she described herself as going through motions that had once been alive and were now simply habits, hollow habits. She said she felt like a marionette of herself, moving in the shapes of faith without feeling any of the substance of it. And then one night, a Tuesday, she remembers she was sitting in the hospital room while her daughter slept. The monitor beeped quietly. The night nurses moved in the corridor outside. Rachel had her Bible open on her lap, but was not reading it. She was just sitting in the silence, too exhausted to perform even the form of prayer. And in that utter exhaustion, that complete giving up of any spiritual effort, something happened that she still struggles to find words for. It was not a voice. It was not a vision. It was not a dramatic emotional experience of the kind she had known in her earlier years of faith. It was more like a quality of the air changed, or something settled inside her that had been moving for 6 months. Or the room, the ordinary hospital room with its linoleum floor and its beeping monitor and its sleeping child, became for a moment that she cannot measure in time. Became for a moment that she cannot measure in time. Saturated with something that could only be described as presence, she did not leap up and shout. She did not weep with relief. She sat there quiet, and something that had been locked inside her chest since the diagnosis simply opened. And in that opening, she did not receive an answer about her daughter's prognosis. She did not hear a promise that everything would be okay. What she received, and she is very careful about how she describes this, was the sense that she was not alone, had never been alone, but was not alone now in the worst night of her life, in the most terrifying silence she had ever known. Her daughter went into remission 8 months later. The cancer did not return. Rachel does not claim a simple causal relationship between that night in the hospital room and her daughter's recovery. But she says, and the way she says it is unlike anything I have heard from anyone who has known only spiritual ease. She says that even if her daughter had not recovered, something that happened that night would have still been real, would have still been true. Because what she found was not a favorable outcome. What she found was a presence that was not conditional on favorable outcomes. That is the fruit of the silence, the pearl hidden in the dark. Because when your faith is built on experiencing favorable outcomes, when God is real to you primarily because things go your way when you believe hard enough, your faith is fragile. It is one bad diagnosis away from collapse, one unanswered prayer away from unraveling. But when your faith has been walked through the fire until what remains is not the comfort of good outcomes, but the reality of a presence that exists regardless of outcomes, that faith is unbreakable, and it is worth everything it costs to arrive at it. Summary: Rachel's story reveals the fruit of the silence in its most profound form. Not an answer, not a resolution, but an encounter with a presence that is not conditional on favorable outcomes. This is the deepest and most durable form of faith, one that has been purified of its dependency on getting what it wants, and arrived at the simple, irreducible reality of divine accompaniment. There is a concept in Jewish spirituality called Hester Panim, the hiding of the face of God. This phrase appears multiple times in the Hebrew scriptures, and it refers specifically to seasons or conditions in which God conceals his presence. The rabbis who have written about this concept over the centuries have offered various interpretations, And it is worth spending some time here because the Jewish theological tradition's engagement with divine hiddenness is, in my opinion, one of the most honest and courageous in the history of religious thought. Hester Panem is not, in the rabbinic tradition, a comfortable or easily explained phenomenon. It is acknowledged as genuinely difficult, as genuinely painful. The psalms of lament, and there are more lament psalms than any other category in the Psalms, are saturated with the anguish of perceived divine absence. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? This is not polite theology. This is raw human protest addressed directly to the divine. And what is remarkable about the Jewish tradition is that it does not smooth this over. It does not offer a tidy resolution to the lament. It holds the tension. It says, yes, God hides his face. And yes, this is agonizing. And yes, we are still in relationship with this God. And yes, the relationship with this God. And yes, the relationship survives the hiding. Not because the hiding stops hurting, but because the relationship is deeper than the hiding. The great 20th century rabbi and philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote about what he called the pathos of God. The idea that God is not unmoved by human suffering, that the divine is not a distant, impassive force that observes creation with detached indifference. Rather, Heschel argued, God is deeply, intimately affected by what happens in the world. Divine silence, in Heschel's framework, is not absence of care. It is the silence of a God who is wounded by what he sees and who works within the constraints of human freedom and historical process toward purposes that often cannot be seen from within. This is profoundly different from the God of simple theism who controls every event and has a simple, neat plan that just needs to be trusted. This is a God who is in some sense present in the suffering, not because he arranged it, but because he inhabits it. Emmanuel, God with us, means not just present in the good times, but present in the breaking. I do not offer this as a complete theological explanation of every form of human suffering. Theodosy, the question of why a good God permits suffering, is one of the most complex and unresolved questions in all of human intellectual history, and I do not pretend to resolve it in a YouTube video. But I offer Heschel's framework because it suggests something important. The silence is not the silence of a God who does not care. It may be the silence of a God who cares so much he cannot be apart from it, who is present in it in a way that goes beyond our categories of presence and absence. Summary, the Jewish concept of Hester Panem, the hiding of God's face, is one of the most honest theological engagements with divine silence in religious history. Heschel's concept of divine pathos adds depth. God is not indifferent to suffering, but present within it. The silence may be not absence of care, but presence of a grief and love too deep for our ordinary instruments to register. I want to take a moment here to speak to those of you who are experiencing the silence in the context of a specific prayer, a prayer for something you have been asking for a very long time. Not a crisis prayer, not an emergency prayer, but the steady, faithful, years-long prayer. The prayer full. Relation spouse that has not come. The prayer for a child that has not been conceived. The prayer for reconciliation in a relationship that has stayed broken. The prayer for direction that has not arrived. The prayer that has been on your lips so long it has worn grooves in you. If that is where you are, I want you to know that this kind of prayer, the long prayer, the faithful prayer, the seemingly unanswered prayer, has its own specific spiritual gravity, and the silence that surrounds it is of a particular kind. There is a parable in the Gospels that often gets explained in a way that I think misses something crucial. It is the parable of the persistent widow, a woman who keeps going to an unjust judge to demand justice and who, through her sheer persistence, finally receives what she asked for. The parable is often taught as, God wants you to keep asking, so just be persistent. And while there is truth in that reading, I think it leaves out something equally important. Look at the end of the parable. Jesus says, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? And then he asks a question that is easy to miss. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? He pivots from the question of whether God will answer to the question of whether we will still be asking when he does. The concern is not God's faithfulness. His faithfulness is assumed. The concern is ours. The long prayer, the faithful persistence, the willingness to keep showing up day after day without the answer. That is the cultivation of a quality in the soul that the answer, when it comes, will require to be received well. There is a version of unanswered prayer that makes us smaller, that shrinks our expectation, deflates our courage, teaches us not to want too much. And there is a version that makes us deeper, that expands our capacity for trust, develops our endurance, builds a quality of longing that will know how to honor what it finally receives. The question, the silence is asking you, if you are in this long prayer season, is not, will God finally give me what I want? The question is, will you remain a person who is capable of receiving it? Summary, long, seemingly unanswered prayers have their own particular form of silence. The parable of the persistent widow reframes the question from whether God will answer to whether we will still be faithfully asking when he does. The long prayer season does not primarily change what God will do. It primarily changes what we become. It develops the capacity to receive what we have been asking for. There is a story I want to share from the life of Mother Teresa that many people know in outline, but few have explored in depth. After her death, letters and journals that she had requested be destroyed were instead preserved and eventually published in a book titled Come Be My Light. And what those documents revealed shocked many people who had only known the public face of her ministry, a life of extraordinary service, joy, and faith. What the letters revealed was that for approximately 50 years, from the late 1940s until her death in 1997, Mother Teresa experienced what she described as complete darkness in her interior spiritual life. She wrote of feeling nothing, of praying and encountering only emptiness, of attempting to connect with the God who had once spoken to her so clearly that she changed the entire direction of her life in response to his voice, and hearing nothing in return. She described the darkness as more painful than anything she had experienced in her most demanding ministry moments. She used the word torture. For 50 years, and during those 50 years, she founded and led one of the most significant humanitarian organizations in modern history. She cared for dying people in the streets of Calcutta. She advocated for the poor before heads of state. She received the Nobel Peace Prize. She inspired millions of people around the world. She was, to almost everyone who encountered her, a person whose spiritual depth and interior life were unmistakable. And the whole time, she was walking through the darkest silence. When this was revealed, the reaction was divided. Some people felt betrayed, felt that the public representation of her faith had been dishonest, that the joy they had seen was a performance. Others felt something very different. They felt seen, because here was the most publicly celebrated believer of their century confessing to exactly what they had been afraid to admit about their own spiritual life. The darkness the silence, the feeling of performing faith without feeling it. But what I find most important in Mother Teresa's story is this: she did not understand her darkness. She wrote about it with genuine bewilderment and genuine pain. She did not have the theological framework we are building together in this video. She did not know why the darkness was there. She was not at peace with it. She simply continued. She continued to show up. She continued to serve. She continued to pray in the darkness as she had prayed in the light. And her life became a testimony not to the triumph of feeling, but to the triumph of commitment. There is a quote from one of her letters that has haunted me since I first read it. Writing to her spiritual director, she said something to the effect that if there was indeed a God and a heaven, she was content to be in whatever darkness was necessary. And if there was no God, if the whole thing was empty, she had at least spent her life caring for the most vulnerable people on earth. Either way, she was at peace with how she had spent her years. That is not resignation. That is the deepest, most radical form of faith I have ever encountered. Summary: Mother Teresa's 50-year interior darkness is one of the most profound examples of divine silence in modern history. Her continued faithfulness without comfort, her service without felt divine companionship, represents the highest form of faith, commitment that does not depend on consolation. Her story is not a tragedy. It is a template for what it means to choose God with no strings attached. By now, you have heard many stories and many frameworks for understanding divine silence. Let us shift the focus somewhat and spend time on the practical question: what do you actually do when God is quiet? Because understanding the meaning of silence is one thing, living through it is another. The first and most important thing is simply this: do not stop speaking, even into what feels like empty air, even when prayer feels like speaking to a wall, even when the words seem to go nowhere, land nowhere, achieve nothing. Keep praying, not because your prayers are magic incantations that force divine response, not because persistence will eventually wear God down, but because prayer in a season of silence is the practice of keeping the relationship active even when the emotional rewards of the relationship have disappeared. It is the spiritual equivalent of writing letters to someone you love when there is no guarantee they will be received. Not because you know they will answer, but because the writing is itself a maintenance of love. And there is something else that happens in the practice of prayer and silence that is genuinely transformative. It purifies the prayer. When prayer always feels good, when there is always an emotional return, there is a real risk that we are praying for the feeling rather than for the reality. But when the feeling is go, nay, and we still show up, what remains is the actual desire, the actual reaching toward the divine. Stripped of its emotional decoration, pure, honest, austere. And that pure prayer is a different quality of connection than the decorated version, even if it feels like nothing. The second practical thing is to change the mode of your seeking. If the form of spiritual practice you have been using has gone silent, try something else, not instead of it, in addition to it. If you have primarily been a verbal prayer person, try silence, intentional, extended silence. Sit for 20 minutes with no words, no music, no agenda, just open space. If you have been primarily a private practitioner, try community. If you have been primarily a community practitioner, try solitude. If you have been primarily intellectual, reading theology, listening to sermons, engaging your mind, try the body. Take a long walk and notice things. Breathe deliberately. Engage your physical senses in the practice of attention. The God who goes quiet in one mode may be speaking in another. And sometimes the silence is an invitation to find the divine in a place you have never looked before. Summary and the practical response to divine silence. 2 things stand above all others. Do not stop speaking and change the mode of your seeking. Prayer in silence purifies the prayer of its emotional decoration and reveals the bare, honest desire at its core. And shifting modes from verbal to silent, from private to communal, from intellectual to embodied, may reveal that God was speaking in a frequency we had not been tuned to. The third practical discipline for the season of divine silence is one that is often undervalued: community. Community. There is a powerful but dangerous temptation when God goes quiet and faith becomes difficult to withdraw from the community of believers, to stop going to church, to stop seths, howling up to the small group, to stop being around people who are singing songs and speaking about God with what seems like easy confidence when you are barely holding on. The contrast between their apparent ease and your very real struggle can make community feel like the wrong place for you. I want to push back on that temptation. Not because community will fix the silence. It will not. Not because being around faithful people will automatically restore your sense of connection. It may not. But because community does something specific and irreplaceable in the season of silence, it keeps you in the story. One of the most disorienting aspects of prolonged divine silence is that it breaks the narrative. When God feels present and active, your life has a sense of narrative coherence. You can see where you came from. You can feel where you are being led. You can identify the hand of God in the events of your days. When the silence descends, the narrative coherence goes with it. Your story stops making sense. It becomes a sequence of events without a through line. Community, when it is functioning well, holds a narrative for you when you cannot hold it yourself. The corporate memory of a faith community, the songs they have been singing for generations, the stories they have been telling, the practices they maintain, all of it carries the narrative through seasons when individuals cannot. You may be in the silence, but around you, people are singing the words. He is faithful. He was faithful before. He will be faithful again. And even if you cannot feel those words, your body hears them. Your memory stores them. They become part of the architecture that will eventually hold you. There is also something specific about being known in community that matters during silence. The temptation to perform in community, to pretend you are fine, to sing the songs without let. Inflict people see your face is real, but community at its best creates the conditions where you do not have to perform, where you can sit in the back, hands not raised, eyes on the floor, and still be held by the people around you, where someone notices, where someone prays for you without needing you to perform faith you do not currently have. If your community does not offer that, if it is a place where doubt and struggle are not welcome, where you feel you must perform, then that is worth addressing. Either by having an honest conversation with a trusted person in that community, or, if necessary, by finding a different community. Because being in the wrong community in a season of silence can make the silence louder rather than helping you endure it. Summary. Community is one of the most powerful resources in the season of divine silence, not because it will restore the felt sense of God, but because it holds the narrative when you cannot. Corporate memory, the songs, the stories, the practices of faithful people, these keep you in the story until you can hold it again. And being genuine known in community without the need to perform is one of the greatest gifts available in the dark. Let us talk about Scripture, specifically how to use Scripture during the silent season, because it can be used in ways that help and ways that do not. There is a pattern I have seen many times. A person in a season of spiritual silence opens their Bible looking for something that will make the silence stop, looking for a promise that will unlock the connection, looking for a verse that will function like a key. And if they find the right one and hold it the right way, the door will open. And when the door does not open, when the verse, however beautiful, does not immediately restore the warmth, they close the Bible with a kind of quiet disappointment and wonder if they are doing it wrong. This approach, though completely understandable, misunderstands the function of Scripture in the season of silence. Scripture in the silent season is not primarily a tool for unlocking divine experience. It is more like a conversation recorded between the divine and humanity across thousands of years. A conversation that includes every experience we have discussed in this video. The longing, the lament, the desert, the silence, the dark night, the long waiting, the moment of breakthrough. All of it is in there. And the value of engaging with it in your silence is not primarily that it will produce a feeling, but that it will orient you within a larger story. It will show you that what you are experiencing is not new. It is not uniquely terrible. It is not a sign of God's unique displeasure with you. It is one chapter in a very long story that has a trajectory. The Psalms are particularly important for the season of silence because they are, among other things, the sacred literature of human spiritual experience in all its rawness, not just the triumphant psalms, not just the praise and thanksgiving, but the lament psalms, the protest psalms, the psalms of absolute desolation, Psalm 22, Psalm 88, Psalm 13. Read them not as texts to be studied, but as prayers to be prayed. Let them give language to what you feel, but cannot articulate. Use them as templates for your own authentic speech toward God. There is a discipline called praying the scriptures, using the language of the biblical text as a vehicle for your own prayer. It is ancient and it is powerful. And it works particularly well in the silence because it does two things simultaneously. It keeps you speaking toward God, and it roots your speech in a tradition that has survived every kind of darkness and come out the other side. The man who wrote Psalm 88, the darkest psalm in the entire Psalter, the one that ends with no resolution, just darkness, that man kept writing. He did not have an answer. He did not have a resolution, but he kept directing his darkness toward the divine. And that act of direction, dark as it was, unresolved as it was, is recorded as sacred text that has sustained millions of people across 3,000 years. Your dark prayer matters. Your unresolved lament is not less sacred than your praise. Bring it. Summary. Scripture during the silent season functions not as a key to unlock divine experience, but as a map showing us where we are in a very long story. The lament psalms are particularly powerful. They give language to anguish, and model the faithful practice of directing darkness toward God. Dark prayer, unresolved lament, honest protest, all of it is sacred, and all of it has a place in the conversation. Here's a question that I think sits at the heart of everything we have discussed. What does God want from us in the silence? It is a question that sounds simple, but contains depth. Because the obvious answer, God wants our faith, our trust, our continued prayer, while true, does not quite reach the thing I am trying to name. So let me try to go a little deeper. I think one of the things God wants in the silence is our honesty. This may sound obvious, but I think the full implications of it are radical. I mean, real honesty, not the honesty of confessing known sins, not the honesty of admitting dependence on God, not the honesty of acknowledging that we need Him. I mean, the honesty of telling God the truth about what you actually think and feel about what is happening, including the things that, if you said them out loud, might feel dangerously close to blasphemy. I am angry. I feel abandoned. I don't understand why you are letting this happen. I prayed and nothing changed, and I don't know what to do with that. I followed I believe was your voice. And it led me here, and here is terrible, and I want to know why. I love you, but right now I also resent you, and I don't know what to do with that either. These are real prayers. They are the prayers of real people who love God deeply. And they are the kind of prayers that, when spoken honestly, rather than suppressed politely, have a way of cracking the silence. Not because the honesty is magic, but because the honesty is relationship. Because you cannot be truly close to someone you are managing. You can only be close to someone to whom you tell the truth. And the God revealed in Scripture, the God of Abraham and Moses, and David and Job, and Elijah in the Psalms of Lament, is not a God who needs to be handled carefully, who requires our careful management of our emotions in His presence. This is a God who invites the full human person, who is not threatened by human anger or wounded by human doubt, who is capacious enough to hold our anguish without being diminished by it. The second thing I think God wants in the silence is our presence, not our performance, not our theological correctness, just our presence. The willingness to show up, even empty, even doubting, even barely functioning, and to be there, directed toward Him, not eloquently, not faithfully in any heroic sense, just present. There is a monastic tradition of what is called the divine office, fixed hours of prayer throughout the day, maintained by communities of monks and nuns. And one of the most important features of this tradition is that it is not optional. You show up whether you feel like it or not. You say the prayers whether you are experiencing God or not. The discipline is not about the quality of the experience, it is about the maintenance of orientation. You keep your face turned in the direction of the divine, day after day, through every season. That susta, in that orientation, that unbroken presence, however hollow it sometimes feels, is itself the relationship. And in the season of silence, that is enough. Summary, what God wants in the silence is honesty and presence, not performance, not theological correctness, not manufactured faith. Real honesty, including anger and doubt, is not rebellion against God. It is the deepest form of relationship with Him, and simply showing up day after day, face turned toward the divine, even in emptiness. That sustained orientation is itself the relationship, and in the silent season, it is enough. Now I want to talk about something that science, theology, and human experience all agree on, though they describe it in different languages. And that is the phenomenon of what happens after the silence. Because the silence does not last forever. Even if it has lasted a very long time for you, even if you are in year 3 or year 5 of a spiritual drought that shows no signs of ending, I want to tell you something important. The evidence of human experience across every culture, every era, every tradition is overwhelming that the silence eventually breaks. Not always in the way people expected, not always producing the outcomes they hoped for, but the silence breaks. And what happens when it breaks is something worth understanding in advance, because it helps you to continue in the silence with a sense of what you are moving toward. One of the consistent reports from people who have walked through prolonged spiritual silence and come out the other side is a quality of encounter that is qualitatively different from anything they experienced before the silence. The German theologian Rudolf Otto coined a term for the experience of the divine that has become one of the most widely used concepts in the study of religion: mysterium tremendum et fascinans. The mystery that is both overwhelming and compelling. The encounter with something so far beyond ordinary categories that it simultaneously fills you with awe and draws you with irresistible attraction. People who have walked through the deepest silences and experienced the return of divine presence often describe their encounters in terms closer to Otto's mysterium tremendum than anything they experienced in their easier, more emotionally comfortable spiritual seasons. The felt presence they encounter after the desert is not the same as the felt presence they knew before. It is deeper, stranger, more overwhelming, more real, in a way that is hard to describe precisely. It is as if the silence stripped away the candy-coated version of spiritual experience, and the encounter they walked into afterward was with the actual thing, undiluted, more terrifying, more beautiful, more real. The mystic traditions describe this as the second conversion. The first conversion is the initial turn toward the divine, the entering of faith, the embrace of belief, the encounter that started the whole journey. The second conversion, which many people never experience because they do not stay in the silence long enough to be brought through it, is a turning toward the divine that no longer rests on feeling, on outcome, on emotional reward. A turning that is, in some sense, final. Not in the sense of complete or perfect, but in the sense of settled, chosen, unretractable. It is the place where faith becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a feeling, but a foundation. Not a mood, but a home. Summary, the silence always breaks. And what is encountered on the other side is qualitatively deeper than what was known before, closer to Otto's mysterium tremendum than to ordinary spiritual feeling. People who walk through the desert and survive it often describe a second conversion, a final, settled turning toward the divine that no longer depends on emotion or outcome. The silence, endured faithfully, leads to the most permanent and real form of spiritual life. Let us talk about joy, because when we talk about divine silence and darkness in desert seasons, there is a risk of painting a picture that is relentlessly grim, and the full truth includes something else. Joy in the silence is real, not the emotional happiness that comes from favorable circumstances, not the cheerful confidence of the person whose prayers are being answered, but the deeper, stranger joy that the Christian tradition calls by its technical name, consolation without cause, a joy that has no apparent reason. That seems to arrive not from good news or answered prayer, but from somewhere else, somewhere beneath circumstance, somewhere that is not touched by what is happening on the surface. People in the darkest seasons sometimes report moments, fleeting, inexplicable, not sustained, of this kind of joy. A moment during a long drive when the music comes on and something lifts. A moment in nature when the beauty of the world seems to assert itself against all the evidence of pain. A moment in the middle of prayer that seemed to be going nowhere, when something not warm, not comfortable, but real stirs in the chest. These moments matter, not as proof that the silence is over, not as evidence that the breakthrough is near, but as signs that the deep center of things is still intact, that beneath all the disruption on the surface, something fundamental is unbroken. These moments are like signals from a deep underground well, brief, quiet, easy to miss, but pointing to a source of life that the drought has not reached. The great theologian Paul, writing from prison, wrote something that has puzzled readers for centuries. I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. He did not say contentment came natural. Lie to me. He said, I learned it. The contentment, the joy that does not depend on circumstances, was the product of a process that included imprisonment, shipwreck, rejection, suffering, and almost certainly seasons of silence that we know about from his biography. He did not start with joy. He arrived at it through the exact kind of journey we have been describing in this video. And the reason I want you to know that joy in the silence is real is this. When the moments of inexplicable, surface-defying, circumstance-resistant joy arrive in your dark season, receive them. Do not dismiss them as accidents or irrationality or temporary emotional fluctuation. They are not just chemistry. They are dispatches from the deep place. They are proof that something in you has not been extinguished. And they are invitations to orient yourself toward the source they are pointing to. Summary joy in the silence is real. Not the joy of favorable circumstances, but the deep, sourceless joy that the spiritual tradition calls consolation without cause. Fleeting and unexplained, these moments signal that the deep center of the soul remains intact. Paul's testimony that contentment is learned rather than given points to the transformative journey through which the most durable joy is found. These moments of inexplicable joy in the dark should be received, not dismissed. I want to speak now about something that is both deeply personal and universally human, the experience of feeling like God has let you down, not the intellectual question of theodicity, not the abstract puzzle of divine silence, the very personal, very specific experience of believing that God was leading you somewhere, that you were following faithfully, that you made choices based on what you believed was divine direction. And then the door closed. The relationship ended. The ministry failed. The pregnancy was lost. The business went under. The thing you were so certain was God's plan turned out not to be, or at least not in the way you understood. And in the rubble of that disappointment, the silence of God carries a particularly sharp edge, because the disappointment is not just about what was lost. Because the disappointment is not just about what was lost. It is about whether you can trust your own discernment, whether the voice you thought you heard was real, whether the whole enterprise of listening to God and following where you believe He leads is ultimately reliable. This is one of the most painful forms of spiritual crisis I know. And I want to address it carefully. First, God's leading does not always mean God's protecting from difficulty or loss. Some of the most important journeys in biblical history led straight through failure, suffering, and death before they arrived anywhere near the promised outcome. Joseph was led into slavery and imprisonment. Abraham was led to lift a knife over his son. The disciples were led to a crucifixion before they were led to a resurrection. If God's leading meant constant protection from harm, these stories would not read the way they do. Second, it is possible to hear God and still not understand where the hearing will take you. The partial direction is real. The destination is real. The path between them may contain things you did not anticipate and were not told about in advance. And the things you did not anticipate, the losses, the failures, the locked doors, may be as much a part of the leading as the original call. Third, and most importantly, the sense of being let down by God deserves to be brought directly to God, not processed privately, not smoothed over with theological reassurance, not suppressed in the name of faithfulness, brought directly, raw, honest to the one who led you there. Because in my experience, and in the experience of every person whose faith I deeply respect, that conversation, that honest, grieving, sometimes accusing conversation is the beginning of the next chapter. The chapter where the picture becomes large enough that the pain begins to find its place in a story that is not over. Summary, the specific pain of feeling that God led you somewhere and then let you down is one of the sharpest forms of spiritual crisis. But biblical history is full of lettings that pass through failure before arriving at their true destination. The response is not to suppress the disappointment, but to bring it directly and honestly to God, because that conversation is the beginning of the next chapter. We have been on a long journey together in this video, And I want to begin moving toward what I think is the most important synthesis of everything we have covered. But before I do, I need to address something I have been saving for this point. Something that I think provides the single most complete framework for understanding why God is quiet, right? When you need Him most, it is the framework of the seed. Everyone who has ever planted something knows that there is a period after the seed is in the ground, after you have done everything you can do, after you have watered and waited, when there is absolutely nothing to see. The surface of the soil is undisturbed. If you did not know you had planted something, you would have no evidence that anything was happening at all. To all appearances, silence, inactivity, nothing. And underground, the most important thing is happening. The seed coat is softening. The first root is pushing down before the first shoot pushes up. The entire energy of the seed is being redirected toward life, and none of it is visible. None of it is felt by the seed in any way that the seed would describe as good. The breaking of the seed coat is not comfortable. The first push of root into unknown. Soil is not comfortable, but everything is happening. This is what the silence of God is in its deepest form. It is not absence of divine activity. It is divine activity occurring in the invisible, in the underground, in the part of your soul that you cannot see and cannot feel, in the root system of your character, your faith, your understanding, your capacity for love and capacity for love and capacity for love. And the reason it is hidden, the reason you cannot feel it, is partly because the process is tender. Newborn roots are fragile. The first growth of something genuinely new in a human soul is not robust. It cannot be exposed to direct sun before it has depth enough to sustain it. It needs darkness and pressure and the holding environment of being fully enclosed in something larger than itself. The day will come when you emerge from the soil, and on that day, on the day the green shoot breaks through and turns toward the light, you will be a different plant than the one that went into the ground. Not just the same seed, slightly improved. Something altogether different in structure and capacity and possibility. The darkness will have done its work. The silence will have spoken its full message. And you will look back at the underground season, at the months or years of invisible growth, and understand, in a way you could never have understood from within it, exactly what was happening the whole time. Summary: the framework of the seed is perhaps the most complete metaphor for divine silence. Nothing is visible on the surface, but underground, the most essential growth is occurring. The tenderness of new root systems requires darkness and pressure before they are strong enough for light. The silence is not inactivity. It is the most intensive period of invisible divine formation. The day of emergence is coming, and when it does, the full meaning of the underground sets. The full meaning of the underground sets. Reason will be clear. Let us talk about the transformation that happens, specifically and practically, when a person walks through a season of divine silence and comes out the other side. Because the changes are not vague. They are not simply more faith or better prayers or a warmer sense of God's presence. They are specific, observable, documented across thousands of years of spiritual autobiography, across modern clinical research on post-traumatic growth, across the reflections of every person who has ever been through this and been willing to look honestly at what it did to them. The first change is in the quality of compassion. People who have walked through prolonged spiritual suffering, who know from the inside what it is to feel abandoned, to pray into silence, to lose the felt sense of the divine, become categorically more capable of sitting with others in their suffering, not because they have the right theological explanations, but because they have been in the dark themselves, and they know that what you need most in the dark is not an explanation. It is presence. They know how to be present in darkness because they have been present to their own. This is one of the reasons why the most pastorally effective people I know are almost never the ones whose lives have been easy. They are the ones who can walk into a hospital room or sit in a living room with someone who has just lost everything and be completely present without needing to fix anything or say anything profound. That capacity, that specific, irreplaceable, desperately needed human capacity, is grown in the dark. The second change is in the nature of prayer itself. People who have walked through prolonged silence and come out the other side generally describe a fundamentally different relationship with prayer than they had before. The prayers are simpler, quieter, less decorated, less focused, add on asking for things and more focused on presence. Just being with God, directing attention toward the divine without agenda, without request, without the need for anything to happen. This is not because they no longer have needs or no longer make requests. It is because the relationship itself has become the primary thing and the requests have found their proper place within it rather than defining it. The third change, which I find particularly beautiful, is in the relationship with mystery. People who have been through the silence and survived do generally become much more comfortable with not knowing, with not having answers, with holding open questions over the long term without needing them resolved. This is not resignation. It is a form of spiritual maturity that recognizes the divine is genuinely beyond full human comprehension, and the posture of humble openness in the face of mystery is not a weakness, but a wisdom. Summary: the transformation produced by walking through divine silence is specific and profound. A deepened compassion that can accompany others in darkness. A simpler, quieter prayer that values presence over petition. And an expanded capacity for holding mystery without requiring resolution. These are not vague improvements. They are the identifiable marks of a soul that has been genuinely transformed by the underground season. I want to spend some time now on what I will call the ministry of the silence, the way that what you have walked through in the quiet equips you for something you could not have been equipped for any other way. There is a pattern that appears in almost every great spiritual biography. The years in the desert precede the years of greatest fruitfulness. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before the burning bush. Paul spent 3 years in Arabia after his encounter on the road to Damascus. 3 years of Sinai, lengths before his extraordinary public ministry began. John the Baptist grew up in the wilderness. Jesus was driven into the desert immediately after his baptism, before his public ministry began. The pattern is striking. The silence, the wilderness, the desert, these come before the most significant impact, as if the public work required a private formation that could only happen in the unseen place. As if the ministry was built on a foundation laid in the dark, and the depth of the foundation determined how tall and how lasting the building above it could be. I believe this with everything I have, and I have seen it borne out repeatedly in the lives of the most genuinely significant people I have known. What you are building in the silence is the thing that will make everything else you do actually matter. The prayer life formed in the desert does not go away when the desert ends. It goes with you into everything you do afterward, into your conversations, your decisions, your relationships, your leadership, your parenting, your work, and people feel it. They may not be able to name what they feel, but they register it. This person has been somewhere. This person knows something. This person can be trusted. That quality cannot be taught. It cannot be performed. It cannot be manufactured. It grows only in one place: the underground season, the silent season, the season when nothing appears to be happening and everything essential is being formed. So let me ask you something, not to minimize what you are going through, but as a genuine question worth sitting with. What is being built in you right now? Not what are you losing, not what feels absent, what is being built in the underground that you cannot yet see, that will become the most important thing about you. Because I believe something is being built. I believe something is always being built when the soil is dar. And the growth is hidden and the surface looks empty. And I believe that the quality of what is built in you will be in direct proportion to the faithfulness with which you stay in the process. Summary: the ministry of the silence is one of the most consistent patterns in spiritual biography. The desert precedes the fruitfulness. The underground season precedes the significant work. What is being built in you during this time cannot be manufactured any other way. And the quality of your faithfulness in the underground season directly determines the depth and durability of everything that grows from it. Let me return to the specific question posed in our title. Why is God quiet right when you need Him most? And let me try to bring everything we have discussed into a final integrated answer. The answer is not simple. It never could be, because the reality it describes is not simple. But I think there are several threads that, woven together, form something coherent and true. First, the silence often comes precisely when you need God most, because the need is part of what creates the conditions for deeper encounter. Comfortable, need-free religious practice produces a particular kind of faith. Desperate, stripped of all other options. Need produces a completely different kind. The silence that arrives with the crisis is not cruelty. It is the removal of everything that was supplementing your relationship with the divine. Everything that was making it comfortable enough that you did not need the actual divine. When all the supplements are removed, what remains is the raw, direct encounter with the divine itself. And that encounter, when it comes, will be the most real thing you have ever known. Second, the silence comes when you need God most, because the forming that the silence does can only happen under pressure. The seed does not germinate without the dark and the wall. The pearl does not form without the irritant. The muscle does not grow without resistance. The formation that the silence accomplishes in your trust, your humility, your compassion, your prayer life, your capacity for mystery, requires the very conditions that the crisis creates. God is not creating the crisis in order to make you suffer, but He is using the crisis to do the most important work available to be done in you. Third, the silence may come when you need God most, because He is trusting you with the weight of the silence itself, with the demand of choosing faithfulness without emotional reward, with the challenge of holding your faith under conditions that would break a less developed soul. The silence in this frame is not God withdrawing. It is God extending to you a form of honor, treating you as capable of the most demanding form of spiritual maturity. Summary: the integrated answer to why God goes quiet precisely when you need Him most weaves together three threads. The silence removes supplements to relationship, leaving only raw encounter. The silence creates the conditions for formation that can only happen under pressure. And the silence may be an expression of divine trust in your capacity for the most demanding form of spiritual maturity. Together, these three truths transform the question from an accusation into an invitation. We are approaching the end of our time together, and I want to use these final sections to give you something practical to carry forward. Not just the understanding of why the silence comes and what it does, but how to live from this point forward, whether you are still in the silence or beginning to emerge from it. The first thing I want to give you is permission. Permission to have walked through what you have walked through. Permission to have doubted. Permission to have felt nothing. Permission to have asked the hard questions. Permission to have been angry, confused, despairing. None of those things made you less faithful. None of them put you beyond the reach of the divine. If anything, they put you squarely in the company of the most faithful people who ever lived. David doubted, Elijah despaired, Job demanded, Thomas doubted, John of the Cross walked in darkness. Mother Teresa felt nothing for 50 years. You are not alone in this. You are not uniquely broken. You are uniquely human, and you are in a process that has a destination. The second thing I want to give you is a practice. It is simple, and it requires almost nothing. It is this: once a day, choose consciously, deliberately, explicitly, even if you do not feel anything, to keep your face turned toward the divine. You do not have to feel it. You do not have to be certain of it. You do not have to have resolved all the questions. Just once a day, in whatever form makes sense to you, a word, a posture, a moment of attention. Choose the direction of the divine. That's it, one choice. Once a day, repeated indefinitely. That practice, maintained faithfully, will accomplish more than you can currently imagine. The third thing is this: look for the signs of life, not the dramatic experiences, the small ones. The moment the air quality changed in that hospital room for Rachel. The still small voice after the wind and earthquake and fire for Elijah. The inexplicable peace that Paul described arriving from a place beyond understanding. These small signs are not nothing. They are signals from the deep well. They are dispatches from the part of you that the silence has not reached. Receive them when they come. Summary practical living forward begins with permission. Permission to have doubted, felt nothing, and questioned. It continues with a daily practice. The simple, deliberate, once-a-day choice to keep the face turned toward the divine, regardless of feeling. And it includes cultivating attention for small signs of life, the dispatches from the deep well that signal the underground work is ongoing. These three practices are the foundation of surviving and being transformed by the silent season. Now I want to speak directly to those of you who are at the very edge, who are not just in a spiritual dry spell, but who are genuinely wondering whether to continue at all, whether to continue in faith, whether to continue in the relationship that has brought you this pain, whether in some cases to continue at all. I hear you, I see you, and I want to take a moment to say something simple and direct. Please do not make a permanent decision based on a temporary experience, however long that experience has lasted. The silence does not last forever. The darkness does not last forever. The darkest night in all of recorded human history, the one that began on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem when the most faithful person who ever lived felt abandoned by the God he called Father, even that night did not last forever. 3 days of absolute bottomless silence. And then the silence broke in the most dramatic, most history-changing, most life-transforming way that any silence has ever broken. I am not making a theological argument about the resurrection here. I am making a human argument. I am saying the worst, most complete, most final seeming darkness has broken before. It will break again. It will break for you. If you are in a place of genuine crisis, if you are not just spiritually empty, but genuinely struggling with your will to continue, please reach out to someone, a pastor, a counselor, a trusted friend, a crisis line, because you deserve support that goes beyond a video. And because your life has value that the current darkness may be obscuring from you, but that is real, is permanent, and is not defined by what you are feeling right now. Hold on. Not because it gets easier immediately. Not because the answer is on its way and you just need to survive the next few hours. But because you have not seen the end of your story yet. And the end of your story is not this silence. Summary, for those at the edge, this is a moment for directness. The silence does not last forever. The darkest night in human history did not last forever. Please do not make a permanent decision based on temporary experience. Your life has value that the darkness may be obscuring. Hold on. The end of your story is not this silence, and you have not seen the end yet. Let us talk about what it means to reemerge. Because the silence eventually breaks, and when it does, there is a reemergence that requires its own kind of intentionality. One of the most common pitfalls when the silence ends and the warmth returns is what I would describe as the rush to forget. The human mind, freed from the pressure of the dark season, naturally moves toward relief, toward gratitude for the restoration, toward the desire to get back to normal, to enjoy the presence, to leave the darkness as far behind as possible. And there is nothing wrong with relief. There is nothing wrong with gratitude. Both are appropriate and beautiful responses to the ending of a hard season. But the rush to forget can rob you of something essential: the integration, the taking stock of what was learned, what was built, what was transformed in the underground. If you rush past that processing, you take the fruit of the silence, all the formation, all the depth, all the new quality of faith, and you fail to consciously own it. It is there underground, but it has not been brought up into full awareness and integrated into how you live, how you pray, how you relate to others in their own dark seasons. The integration is what turns the dark season from something that happened to you into something that became part of who you are. And who you are is what you will offer to the world. So when the silence breaks, take time. Do not rush back to spiritual normalcy. Sit for a while in the threshold, in the space between the dark season and the next season, and do some deliberate accounting. What changed in me? What do I know now that I did not know before? What do I trust now that I could not trust before? How do I pray differently? How do I see others differently? What qualities were built in me in the dark that I want to carry consciously into the light? Write it down if you can. Speak it to a trusted person. Let it become part of your story in a way that you can tell, because the story of your dark season, integrated and owned and told with honesty, that story will be one of the most valuable gifts you ever give another person. Summary: when the silence ends, the temptation to rush back to normalcy is understandable, but potentially costly. Integration, the conscious owning of what was learned and built in the dark, is what transforms a hard season into a permanent gift. Take time in the threshold, do the accounting, write it, speak it, own it, and then carry it forward, because the story of your dark season will be one of the most powerful things you ever offer the world. There is a phrase I want to leave you with before we reach the conclusion. It comes from a modern spiritual writer, and I want to paraphrase it rather than quote it directly, because I think the idea is more important than any particular formulation. The idea is this: in seasons of divine silence, what is required of us is not perfect faith. It is not unwavering certainty. It is not the performance of emotions we do not have. What is required is simply faithfulness to the next small step, the next prayer, the next showing up, the next turning of the face in the direction we believe is true, even without any felt confirmation that we are right. Faithfulness is not a state. It is not a feeling. It is not an achievement. It is a repeated action. It is the next small step, taken despite the darkness, in the direction of what you believe is real. And then the next step. And then the next step. And then the next. And over time, over days and months and sometimes years, those small, faithful steps accumulate into something extraordinary, into a life shaped by the divine, into a person who has been through fire and is not ash, into a faith that does not need to be told it is real, because it has been tested down to its roots, and the roots held. That is the destination of the silence. Not a feeling, not an experience. A person, shaped, formed, deepened, and made by the very process that hurt the most into something closer to what they were always meant to be. Rachel's daughter is 11 years old now. Rachel tells the story of the hospital room to anyone who needs to hear it. Not because the story has a happy medical ending, though it does, but because she carries something in her now that she describes as quieter, deeper, and more unshakable than anything she knew before the silence. She does not need the warmth the way she used to. She does not doubt the presence the way she used to. She had been too deep into the dark and found too clear a signal there to be troubled by surface silence anymore. That is the gift. That is the pearl. That is the destination. Summary faithfulness in the silence is not a state or a feeling, but a repeated action. The next small step taken in the direction of what you believe is real. Those accumulated steps taken in the dark over time build a life in a person that the darkness, for all its weight, could not destroy. Rachel's story completes the arc, from the silence to the encounter to the unshakable, knowing that no future silence can undo. Let us move now toward our final thoughts. But before we do, I want to summarize the arc of the journey we have taken together. Because the picture that all of this forms, when you see it whole, is one of the most important pictures a human being can hold. We began with the experience of silence itself, the raw, disorienting, painful experience of praying and hearing nothing. We gave it names. Rachel's story, Spurgeon's depressions, the 400 years between the Testaments, Elijah under the juniper tree. We established early and clearly that this experience is not unusual, not a sign of unique failure, not a mark of divine displeasure. We explored what the silence is not punishment, not the result of insufficient faith, not evidence that God does not exist or does not care. We explored what it is: a space, a process, a formation, a purification, a preparation. We visited John of the cross and the dark night of the soul. We visited the neuroscience of spiritual experience and the way that crisis disrupts the brain's capacity to register the divine. We sat with Thomas à Kempis and his invitation to interior stillness. We listened to Mother Teresa and her 50 years of darkness that produced 50 years of fruitful ministry. We talked about the specific forms of silence, grief, the long prayer, the experience of feeling led somewhere that became painful. The silence that we sometimes create through protective withdrawal. And we talked about what to do within the silence. Keep speaking change modes, engage community, pray the limit psalms, practice daily choice. We talked about what comes after. The deeper encounter, the second conversion, the 3 specific transformations in compassion, in prayer, in comfort, with mystery. The ministry of the silence, the C framework, the moment of reemergence, and the importance of integration. All of it pointing toward one central, irreducible truth. Summary: the full arc of the journey, from raw experience to framework, to transformation, to destination, points toward a single truth that all the exploration has been building toward. The next section will state that truth as clearly and completely as possible. Here then is the truth. God is quiet when you need him most, not because he is withdrawn from you, but because what you need most is not what you think you need most. What you think you need most is reassurance, comfort, the warm, palpable sense of divine presence, an answer, a quick resolution, the removal of the pain and the restoration of the ease. What you actually need most, what your soul needs at the deepest level, what your faith needs to be the thing it is capable of being, what your future needs to be built on a foundation that will hold whatever is coming is what can only be built in the silence. The meaning of what you actually need most does not look like what you need in the moment. It looks like darkness. It feels like absence. It presents itself as the exact opposite of what you asked for. But it is the answer. The truest, most complete, most generative answer to the prayer behind your prayer. The prayer you did not know you were praying, but the prayer your deepest self has always been praying. Make me real. Make me deep. Make me the person I was created to be. Make my faith unshakable. Make my love unconditional. Make my compassion vast enough to hold others as I have been held. That prayer is being answered. In the silence, right now, God is not quiet because He does not hear you. God is quiet because He is answering the prayer behind your prayer. Because He is doing the deepest work in you that needs to be done. Because He is building the foundation for a life and a faith and a person that will be when the building is complete, something extraordinary, something that glorifies the silence that built it, something that the seasons of noise and ease and easy comfort could never have produced. Hold on, the silence has something to say. Summary, the central truth: God is quiet when you need Him most because He is answering the prayer behind your prayer, the prayer for depth, realness, unshakable faith, and unconditional love. The silence is not absence. It is the answer. Not the one you asked for, but the one your soul most needs. And what is being built in the silence will be, when complete, the most important thing about you. I want to spend a little time in this penultimate section acknowledging something honestly. Everything I have said in this video is true, and none of it fully takes away the pain. The frameworks help. The stories help. Understanding that the silence is purposeful rather than punitive, that it forms rather than abandons, genuinely helps. And for some of you, this video may have provided a turning point, a moment of perspective that shifts something real. But for others, the pain is too large for perspective to reach right now. And that is okay. You do not have to have a theological framework for your suffering in order for your suffering to be honored. The silence does not have to make sense to you in order for it to be real and valid and worthy of grief. What I've tried to give you in this video is not a bypass around the pain. I have tried to give you a context for it, a place to stand while you are in it, not a place above the pain, looking down at it with equanimity, a place within it where you can keep breathing, a place within it where you can keep breathing, where you can keep taking the next step, where you can continue to hold the connection, however tenuous it feels, to the source of all life and all meaning and all love. I believe in that source. I believe in the reality of the divine. I believe that the love at the center of the universe is not indifferent to what you are going through. I believe with everything I have that the silence is not the end of the story. But I also know that belief, stated by someone else, does not always bridge the distance between the head and the heart. The knowing does not always become the feeling. And in the gap between knowing and feeling, in the days when you are simply enduring, simply breathing, simply existing, that is a form of faithfulness too. One of the most pure and real and sacred forms. I see it. I honor it, and I believe that God, who is at the center of all of this, sees it and honors it too. Summary, honest acknowledgement. The frameworks do not fully take away the pain. The goal has never been to bypass suffering, but to provide a place to stand within it. And in the gap between knowing and feeling, in the days of simply enduring, there is a form of faithfulness that is among the most pure and real and sacred that exists. It is seen, it is honored. Concilion, we have come a long way together. 50 chapters of experience, theology, psychology, neuroscience, biography, and story, all in service of a single question that for so many of us is not an academic question, but a deeply personal, urgent, painful one. Why is God quiet right when you need Him most? And what I hope you carry away from this conversation is not a tidy answer, because the reality is too large for a tidy answer. What I hope you carry is a new set of eyes. Eyes that can see in the dark. Eyes that can read the silence, not as abandonment, but as language. Eyes that can perceive, however dimly, however tentatively, the outline of something being built in you that could not be built any other way. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The silence is not emptiness. It is fullness that has not yet taken a form you can see or feel or touch, but it is working. Even now, even in the worst of it, the underground is alive. Rachel is sitting in a church right now, and sometimes she reaches a hand to the seat beside her because she can feel, not emotionally, not as a performance, but as a simple-bodied knowing that she is not alone in it. Spurgeon preached to thousands with a darkness in him that made his words about grace unusually real. Mother Teresa held dying strangers in an interior dark that somehow produced in her hands an extraordinary tenderness. Elijah got up. David kept writing. Job got his answer. The 400 years ended with a baby's cry in a stable in Bethlehem. And you, wherever you are, whatever has brought you to this point in your faith and your life, you are not at the end. You are in the middle. And the middle is always the most difficult part of any story. The middle is where the hero has left the familiar world but has not yet reached the destination. The middle is where the seed is underground and the surface is steer. Alio. The middle is where the most important work is happening. Keep going. You have been built for this. Not in the sense that God designed your suffering. I do not believe that. But in the sense that what is being formed in you through this very experience is the thing that will make you capable of whatever comes next. You are being prepared for something. You are being made more equal to your own life. And the silence that has hurt so much is not the enemy of that preparation. It is the means of it. Bring your honesty to God. Bring your lament. Bring your protest. Bring your doubt. Bring your anger. Bring your emptiness. Bring it all. Nothing you bring will be too much. Nothing you bring will end the relationship. The relationship is larger and more resilient and more unconditionally committed to you than your most desperate fear can comprehend. Keep the face turned toward the divine. Once a day, in whatever form you can manage, not because you feel anything, not because the answer has come, but because the orientation is the practice, and the practice is the relationship, and the relationship is the most real thing that exists. And finally, hold the story open. Do not close it here in the silence before it has finished being told. Do not write the conclusion before the final chapters have been lived, because the final chapters, the ones that come after the underground season, after the desert, after the dark night, those are the chapters that make sense of everything. Those are the chapters that reveal why the silence was not the absence of God, but the most intimate form of His presence. The silence that did not speak in the ways you expected, because it was speaking in the only way deep enough to do what needed to be done. The silence has something to say. Be still enough, long enough to hear it. This is the end of this video, but it is not the end of your state. Ori, not by a long way. The best chapters are still ahead. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. And thank you for having the courage to sit with the hardest question instead of running away from it. That courage is already evidence of something that the silence has been building in you. You just may not be able to see it yet, but you will.